Welcome back, YouTubers. This is What's the Science Behind That. So in today's video, we'll be talking about the lost city of Atlantis. This is from a biblical standpoint, that is. I am going to provide a link in the description box below, which provides real scientific physical evidence that the lost city of Atlantis actually existed. Now, Atlantis has been the focus of much conjecture for thousands of years. Atlantis is a theme of modern science fiction, hotels, cartoons, and much, much more. Now let's take a fresh look at it from a biblical perspective. The island of Atlantis was first mentioned and recorded by Plato in his dialogues. The dialogues of Timaeus, and I believe it's pronounced Critias. Plato's mentioned that this rather large island was later destroyed by a great earthquake. The time frame for this written account is said to be about 350 to 400 years before Christ. According to Plato, Atlantis was named Atlas, who was supposedly the oldest twin of Poseidon, the son of Cronus in Greek mythology. Furthermore, Poseidon was the owner of the island and named it after his son. Other places also reflects Atlas, such as the Atlantic Ocean or the Atlas Mountains extending from Morocco to Algeria. According to Plato's account, quoting, of Socrates, an account of Solon's account that he receives from the Egyptians, the Athenians, which are the people of the city of Athens, and perhaps others in Greece, went to war, and those inhabiting the island of Atlantis. The Atlanteans had conquered parts of modern-day Italy and North Africa, and were threatening Greece and Egypt. According to the account, many of the Athenians may have died while fighting the Atlanteans not long before the island's destruction. Since this subject has been tied to the event of Noah's flood, I think one of the questions we need to clear up is it pre-flood or post-flood? That's one of the questions that needs to be addressed. When it comes down to it, either Atlantis was a real place or it wasn't. If it wasn't, then the discussion is more or less finished. And considering that this story was passed down several times before Plato recorded it, we can assume that it has some inaccuracies. Regardless, let's assume for a moment that it was a real place, and use a biblical framework to replace it. Some explanations could be: 1. Atlantis was destroyed by the flood, and we should not expect to find remnants of it. Or 2. Atlantis was destroyed after the flood, and its remnants may still exist. So could Atlantis have been a pre-flood continent? Maybe. So, if there would be little evidence left due to such a worldwide cataclysm, however, the Critias account by Plato reads just this: which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside the pillars of Hercules, and all those who dwelt within them. This war I am going to describe. One of the combatants on the one side, the city of Athens, was reported to have the leader, to have been the leader and to have fought out the war. The combatants on the other side were commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which was saying, which an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, and when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud and voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. So, also in Plato's account of Atlantis, he refers to the Atlantic Ocean as well as the Pillars of Hercules, which is likely the Strait of Gibraltar between modern-day Spain and Morocco. Plato said that Atlantis was as large as Libya and Asia. Now, Asia was originally seen as a part of modern-day Turkey. Now, keep in mind that this is not what we think of today as Libya and Asia. but the way the Greeks viewed them about 500 BC. Take note that these post-flood features in names. Plato also gives the dimensions of the main island of Atlantis in a measurement that he called stadia, which are about 600 feet each. The dimensions were 2,000 by 3,000 stadia. It was an oblong-shaped island. Translating this into modern measurements, it would have been about 227 miles by 340 miles, giving the estimated 77,000 square mile area. This is about the size of the state of Nebraska. Plato's measurements make Atlantis much smaller than a continent. Descriptions given by Plato appear to place it outside of the Mediterranean in the Atlantic Ocean. Since the modern continent scheme was changed significantly from the flood, and Plato was referred to post-flood places, it is very unlikely that this Atlantis was pre-flood. Plato's book, Critias, gives details of the island and much more, such as the ancient Egyptians originating the account, implying that if it existed, it was likely post-flood. Egypt was formed by Mizraim, which is Noah's grandson, and is still known as Mizraim in the Hebrew language. So, for Egypt to be aware of it, it requires Noah's grandson, Mizraim, to have existed to begin Egypt. If so, descriptions given by Plato appear to place it outside of the Mediterranean in the Atlantic Ocean. In the past, people have proposed likely places for Atlantis, such as the Americas or parts of it, remnants of the island of Thera, which is in the Mediterranean, which should be ruled out by Plato's statements, or the Azores in the Atlantic. But there has never been a consensus by researchers that any of these places were indeed Atlantis. Now that we addressed that Atlantis is post-flood, where exactly in time did this take place? One of the questions that come up was it before or after the destruction of the Tower of Babel? Plato also uniforms us that Atlantis was inhabited by Poseidon and his family, including Atlas. Before people began thinking, you are talking about Greek mythology, okay? Take note that Poseidon was the son of Cronus, which is a variant of Septimus, or who's known as Kittim. Biblically, Kittim is the son of Javan, the son of Japheth, the son of Noah. With this in mind, Atlas was likely Noah's 3 times great-grandson. So, when Plato speaks of Poseidon inheriting the island from the dispersion of people around the world, this makes sense. Kittim, Poseidon's father, was mentioned in the Tower of Babel account. With the Tower of Babel dispersion happening just over 100 years after the flood, according to Usher, then the earliest Atlantis could have been inhabited was soon after that time. Then, when might have Atlantis have been destroyed? According to Plato, Poseidon's his control of Atlantis had already been given to Atlas, after whose death several kings had ruled by the time the disaster struck the island. If Poseidon was the great-great-grandson of Noah, the same as Eber, who was the father of the Hebrews in a different lineage, then it is reasonable to assume that his life expectancy would be near the same as Eber and Atlas, which may have been near the same as Eber's son Peleg. The ages of the post-flood patriarchs dropped off after Noah. Patriarch Noah, 950. Patriarch Shem, 600. Patriarch Arphaxad, 438. Patriarch Shelah, or Sheila, I think it's pronounced, 433. Patriarch Eber, 464, and Patriarch Peleg, 239. Now, Eber, who was born 66 years after the flood, would have died 300, I'm getting my numbers all mixed up. He would have died 530 years after the flood. Had Poseidon lived about this long as well, then this would have been about 1818 BC, according to Ushers, who put the flood at 2348 BC. This would have been about the time Abraham died as well. Peleg died sooner, and assuming that Atlas was contemporary, he too should have died much sooner than Poseidon. He should, as should the next few in the line. Using these assumptions, about 1818 BC, which would have been the earliest that Atlantis could have been destroyed. To give you some context, Moses and the Exodus from Egypt would have occurred in 1491 BC, or about 850 years after the flood, using Usher's numbers. So, it makes sense that there would have been some time before the destruction of Atlantis. Plato records this. Now, Atlas had a numerous and horrible family, and they retained the kingdom, the eldest son, handing it on his eldest for many generations. Now, remembering the limitations of Plato's account, this suggests several generations of rule well after Poseidon's son Atlas. Plato even records that their own law had been passed down by Poseidon, so it appears Poseidon had probably died by the time of the destruction of the island. So, let's use the earliest estimate date for Poseidon's death at 1818 BC. The latest Atlantis could have been destroyed would have been prior to Socrates, who died around 400 BC. But the account came through an age Solon, who got it from the Egyptians and their accounts of the past. So the latest date would surely be a few hundred years prior to Socrates' death. To be generous, let's set 600 BC as the latest as the latest date. So we would have a range of 1818 BC to about 600 BC. So what actually happened to Atlantis? First, it could have been completely destroyed by an earthquake, volcano, or other type of disaster, or perhaps the remnants of Atlantis that Plato wrote of have been destroyed since the time of his writings. Plato records that it was associated with a great earthquake. Perhaps it was even felt in Greece. According to Plato's account in Timaeus, the oceans where Atlantis used to be was nearly impassable by boat due to mud and debris from the island. However, in 2,000 to 3,000 years, such sediment could have traveled and settled out in other areas due to ocean current, tides and storms, and so on. So, that may not be a good sign to look for today. Perhaps groups of islands may be the place to look for in the Atlantic Ocean, extending from the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. But this is just a speculation. We may never know where it was actually located. Could the destruction of Atlantis have been caused by a sudden rise of sea level? Now there's a good question. Creationists have often pointed out that there was a post-flood ice age that was triggered by the flood. In brief, conditions following the flood, which would have yielded warm oceans and cool summers due to massive volcanic activity associated with the flood, plate movements during the flood, the mountains building at end stages and soon after the flood. With fine ash hovering in the upper atmosphere and being replenished with each volcano, this reflects sunlight back to space, hence cooling the globe warmer oceans due to plate movements, and heated rocks under the oceans increase evaporation, which cause more rainfall, or in winter months more snowfall. With cooler summers not melting the snow, it accumulates into ice. Many layers of ice quickly form. Therefore, this would have a rapid growth of glaciers and ice caps. From a big picture, an ice age takes water out of the ocean and deposits it on land. This means the ocean levels would have been reduced. Both Christians and non-Christians agree that the ice age would reduce ocean levels significantly, to a point where land bridges open up, which is likely how many people and animals could have migrated to most continents. But at the time, or at the end of the peak of the ice age, water levels in the oceans began to rise as glaciers and ice caps melted. Creationists have pointed out that the peak of the ice age would have been in the neighborhood of about 500 years after the flood. For example, creationist researcher Mike Oward has estimated that there was an extensive melting for the next 200 years. If Atlantis' destructions were 700 or 800 years after the flood, it may have had something to do with the rising of ocean levels. Keep in mind that an island being overtaken by rising sea levels appear identical to an island sinking. Where might have the Atlanteans, where might Atlantis have been? The Americas can easily be ruled out due to size, but also because Timaeus refers to a continent set beyond it. This continent is likely the Americas. Most obviously, the Americas still exist and have not sunk into the sea. In addition, the island of Thera is within the Mediterranean Sea, so this would rule out as well. Perhaps the most famous report of Atlantis came from Athanasius Kircher from Subterraneous in 1669. He drew a map and placed Atlantis between Africa and Europe in the Americas. Take note that north is facing the bottom on the map. The size of Kircher's Atlantis is much larger than Plato's description, but it is in the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, Kircher's version of Atlantis appears as large, if not larger, than Greenland. So, this may not have been as accurate as it could have been. However, the island is where Azores now sits. And of the logical places Atlantis could have been, the remnants spoken of by Plato could be the Azores, or perhaps the Canary Islands, or even the Madeira Islands. Plato states this. The consequence is that in comparison of what was then, there were remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called, as in this case of small islands. All the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the land being left. This is, of course, assuming the mountaintops still remain to this day as islands. The Azores sits above the mid-Atlantic ridge, where many Christians believe some of the springs of the great deep burst forth. This is referring to Genesis 7:11. This area was likely wrought with earthquake and volcanic activity. But would this area be an obvious passage of mud and debris for several years for those sailing out of the Mediterranean Sea? Since it seemed rather well known that mud and debris caused near impasse for ships, this may not be where Atlantis was. It doesn't seem as logical since fewer ships were traveling that far into the Atlantic, as opposed to other few locations. Madeira Island and the Canary Islands are aloft volcanoes as well. These in these areas may be more apt to cause a problem with ships trying to pass if demolished. So, near the Strait of Gibraltar, a few potential areas are shown on the map for the island of Atlantis. Several of these island chains, such as Azores, Madeira or Canary Islands could be the remains Plato wrote about. But without further research, it would not be wise to comment further. So the conclusion is, we may never know where Atlantis existed. Now, assuming that it did exist, it was most likely a post-flood island somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, not far from the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis, if the accounts were reasonably accurate, would have been destroyed, leaving only much smaller islands still sitting above the Atlantic surface ocean. I said that wrong. Sitting above the Atlantic Ocean's surface. Sorry about that. The most logical remnants would seem to be the Canary or the Madeira Islands, as well as other underwater islands in their vicinity that may have further been destroyed 3,000 years ago or more. That is basically the biblical aspect for the lost city of Atlantis. Once again, recap, I am going to leave a link in the description box below that'll provide a better description, some physical scientific evidence for the lost city of Atlantis, showing that this island may have actually existed. I hope you found this video pretty educational, helpful. I hope you may have learned something new about Atlantis that you probably didn't or hadn't already learned about Atlantis yet. My personal opinion and belief is that Atlantis did exist. Again, that's just my opinion. You guys can choose whether or not to believe Atlantis existed, but that's just my opinion that it did exist. Let's see. If any questions or comments pertaining to the video, please feel free to let me know in the comment box below. And without further ado, this is the end of the video. And until then, I'll see you next time for further more videos. Ciao, YouTube. And recorded by Plato and his dialogues. The dialogues of Timaeus, and I believe it's pronounced Critias. Plato's mentioned that this rather large island was later destroyed by a great earthquake. The time frame for this written account is said to be about 350 to 400 years before Christ. According to Plato, Atlantis was named Atlas, who was supposedly the oldest twin of Poseidon, the son of Cronus in Greek mythology. Furthermore, Poseidon was the owner of the island, Chryses. Regardless, let's assume for a moment that it was a real place, and use a biblical framework to replace it. Some explanations could be: 1. Atlantis was destroyed by the flood, and we should not expect to find remnants of it. Or 2. Atlantis was destroyed after the flood, and its remnants may still exist. So could Atlantis have been a pre-flood continent? Maybe. So, if there would be little evidence left due to such a worldwide cataclysm, however, the Critias account by Plato reads just this, which and named it after his son. Other places also reflects Atlas, such as the Atlantic Ocean or the Atlas Mountains extending from Morocco to Algeria. According to Plato's account, quoting, of Socrates, an account of Solon's account that he receives from the Egyptians, the Athenians, which are the people of the city of Athens, and perhaps others in Greece, went to war, and those inhabiting the island of Atlantis. The Atlanteans had conquered parts of modern-day Italy. Welcome back, YouTubers. This is what's the science behind that. So in today's video, we'll be talking about the lost city of Atlantis. This is from a biblical standpoint, that is. I am going to provide a link in the description box below, which provides real scientific physical evidence that the lost city of Atlantis actually existed. Now, Atlantis has been the focus of much conjecture for thousands of years. Atlantis is a theme of modern science fiction, hotels, cartoons, and much, much more. Now let's take a fresh look at it from a biblical perspective. The island of Atlantis was first mentioned in North Africa, and were threatening Greece and Egypt. According to the account, many of the Athenians may have died while fighting the Atlanteans not long before the island's destruction. Since this subject has been tied to the event of Noah's flood, I think one of the questions we need to clear up is it pre-flood or post-flood? That's one of the questions that needs to be addressed. When it comes down to it, either Atlantis was a real place or it wasn't. If it wasn't, then the discussion is more or less finished. And considering that this story was passed down several times before Plato recorded it, we can assume that it has some inaccuracies.